going on, everyone? Welcome to episode 38 of the Data Driven Strength Podcast. Today, myself and Zach have a handful of questions lined up from you guys. The plan was for episode 37 to be a Q&A, but we got a really good question when we initially pulled you guys on Instagram for some questions, and we kind of turned episode 37 into a deep dive that was kind of in the weeds on the topic of volume for strength. Probably not the most practical episode. I think it was a really good one, but probably not the most practical episode. So we're going to actually do the Q&A this time and make this episode as practical as possible. And this episode will probably be on the shorter side as well. I'm sitting on a stool right now without any back support. I can already feel the back fatigue a little bit. So the shorter the better. We'll try to make this as practical as possible for you guys. All right. The first question is from Clint, who is actually one of Drake's clients. Before I read off Clint's question, just a friendly reminder: if you get value out of this podcast, if you want to support what we do, rating and review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, those go a long way. Sharing it on your Instagram story, all that stuff is much appreciated. And as always, you can check out the services and things we offer in the description of this podcast. All right, so Clint's question. I like it because it makes our coach Drake look really, really good. So I'll kind of summarize a little bit. Basically, he asks if the individual's training status, so whether they're beginner, intermediate, or advanced, changes based on whether they've had like previous coaching or like just good programming in general. So specifically in Clint's case, he's saying, hey, I've been training for over 15 years. And 6 of those years have been specific for to powerlifting. So I think the last 6 years. And over that 6-year time period, his total has increased a ton, right? It's increased 200 kilos, he said. But of those 6 years, it sounds like the first 3.5 of those, he was self-coached, and he only increased 100 kilos. And then he said once he got coaching with Drake, he started making progress much more rapidly. So Zach, I'll let you kind of riff on that in terms of how previous training history and the quality of that training history might influence like how you perceive whether an individual is beginner, intermediate, or advanced.
Yeah, I'm going to kind of question. That's not the right way to say it. I guess ultimately what I want to say first on this question is I ultimately don't think like the categorization of like lifter advancement really matters too much. At least in my opinions, I think it does on the extremes. If you're like just brand new to lifting, or you have been training for a very long time, and you maybe have an alternative anecdote to what a coach generally finds to be successful, that might lead you to kind of a different approach than you would generally take. But other than that, I don't think that really factors into my management very often. So from like a practical perspective, I think this may be interesting to kind of think about, but I don't know if this actually would influence my management all that much. And it also makes me wonder that obviously there's a lot of factors that go into the rate of progression. And it wouldn't just be your training advancement. So even that is a little bit difficult to draw a direct line to. We have all these additional factors such as stress, sleep, all those kind of things that can further manipulate your rate of progression that are independent of training status. So once again, if you are tying training status to rate of progression, there's other factors that play into that make it a little bit hard to tell. So for both of those reasons, I would say it's really cool, and obviously we're happy to hear you're making really good progress, but I don't necessarily think from a practical perspective that your categorization of your training status really matters as far as that goes, if that makes sense.
Yeah, totally agree. And I would say even if you hold everything constant, like those outside factors, sleep, stress, lifestyle, nutrition, and as well as like years of good training, I think rates of progress are also quite individual. I think is another thing. So I don't think you can like. It's just once you get past that first maybe year of half decent training, I just don't even think in terms of like training status. I just don't think it really influences management. Like if you literally have no other information to go off of, it might influence starting points to some degree. But like like Zach said, the anecdotes and previous input from input based on previous training history is absolutely going to prevail. I actually was listening to uh, a Q&A with Steve DeNovi, um, Marcellus, I'm blanking on his last name, and Brad Couillard. And Steve was saying, like, he didn't really think there's a huge difference between coaching, like, I guess, an intermediate person and a highly advanced person. And that's been my experience as well, is that the process is the same, right? In general, you're finding the best possible starting point based on all the inputs you have. And then you iterate from there based on what makes the most sense based on kind of what you're seeing. So, the short answer, Clint, is yes, it probably does influence like training status in a technical sense, but it doesn't really matter in practice, I don't think. Anything to add in there, Zach, or can I read you into the next one?
I can go for it.
Cool. All right, the next one is from a username I'm not even going to try to say because I don't know what exactly that is. So the answer or the question is whether you should progress volume or increasing load to increase strength. I'm assuming this is kind of like on a week to week basis.
All right. So, gonna need to get some definitions out of the way here. So, I'm going to assume this individual means set volume. Um, that we're trying to increase versus increasing, load as in like absolute weight on the bar. Because if you mean volume load, which is just sets times reps times weight or total work, if you're increasing load week to week and keeping some other things constant, those both could simultaneously be going up. So that wouldn't be like a versus in that case. So I'm going to assume this question means increasing set volume per every week versus increasing load on the bar. So I think kind of the standard answer here is that for specifically for 1RM strength gains, I would say load or the load in which you train with is definitely going to be a much better predictor of strength gains on the group level than volume. So on as a kind of a default model, I think we should probably prioritize the loads that we are trying to achieve, specifically the peak loads each week to maximize the expression of strength in the short to moderate term. I think that's probably going to be the standard answer to this question. Now, if we add some context onto this and some anecdote, I do think that there is definitely some individual variation to the degree of diminishing returns for each of these variables in my experience. So some individuals may see, a very strong dose response relationship between the average loads that they lift and the strength gain return that they get. As an example, if you have an average load per week of 70% versus 80% versus 90%, some individuals are going to see a very linear increase in returns in terms of strength gains from that. Now, others, in my experience, I've seen do not have that same relationship, and there's a strong tapering effect in terms of going from 70 to 80 results in X amount of strength gains, but 80 to 90 is considerably less than that. I've seen that quite a few times. And in that case, it may be another variable that seems to be a little bit more predictive on the individual level for strength gains. And an easy example that I've found for this is bench press. Just seems to be one sometimes for some individuals that, keeping volume around seems to be a little bit more important for some individuals than trying to reach as heavy a loads as possible. You still obviously have to train with high loads occasionally, get some practice in, and still be familiar with those conditions. But the pendulum isn't as far swung in that direction as you maybe would expect if you're looking at the stock standard answer for this. That's kind of where my head goes when listening to this question. But to purely answer the original question, if we are kind of going this either or, I would probably opt towards the loading option. Although obviously these don't have to be viewed mutually exclusive. Those kind of standard caveats out of the way. But that's kind of where my head went. What do you think?
Yeah, so I think that makes a lot of sense in terms of like, which is more important, volume or load. And in general, in the short to moderate term, load is going to kind of be higher on that hierarchy, if you will. I think another question that might be interesting to quickly touch on is like, how about from like a weekly progression standpoint, right? Like, should we try to add volume on a week to week basis, and if we go off of Zach's definitions, adding sets each week versus trying to, you know, add weight each week. I don't think that is a good dichotomy to make by any means. In general, I would say though that adding sets each week doesn't make a ton of sense for strength training in our opinions, and doesn't tend to go very well, just in our experience. Uh, I think it makes a lot of sense to potentially have deload and intro weeks with lower set volumes, but when you're in kind of like your main training weeks, your the kind of meat of your training, if you will, having a constant set volume is probably ideal, because that I'd say the primary reason for that is it allows you to see what works, right? If you are going from 4 sets per week to 10 sets per week over the course of a block in kind of a linear fashion, and the block goes great, like what what did they respond well to? Is it the fact that they did add sets? Did they really benefit from those earlier weeks with lower volumes, or those later weeks with really high volumes? So we kind of view volume as something that more or less stays constant, and you just kind of see what happens, and then you adjust that as needed, kind of on a macro level for each lift. Whereas load progression is going to kind of just be a byproduct of the flow, if you will, throughout a training block, right? So like you might start a training block at slightly lower RPEs to kind of introduce yourself, and then maybe by the end of the block you're trying to hit something in the RP 8 to 10 range at a certain rep target. So I think load progression is just always going to kind of be natural, and then you also have to layer on the fact that you're probably going to get stronger throughout a block, right? And if the goal is to have a consistent relative stimulus, then you're going to have to add load to the bar as you adapt. Now, of course, it has to be auto-regulated as well, when appropriate, in order to ensure that relative stimulus does not get too high or too low, right? So yeah, overall, keep volume constant, but in general, if we're thinking about which variable, volume or intensity, volume or load, I should say, is more important, is load is going to kind of prevail in the short to moderate term, but that's not really a dichotomy that makes a lot of sense, because you need volume to progress, and obviously you have the long term considerations as well from a muscle growth perspective.
Yeah, cool. All right, so I think we're good on that one. So let's go ahead and kind of roll into the next one here. So the next question's from Isaac, and his is pretty simple. What are some tips for those who are self-programming / coaching?
Yeah, I'm going to kind of talk about my personal experience with this, because I've been doing this for a while, and I've kind of tried to reflect on when it's gone better than other times. And for me personally, and I've a lot of the people we coach are also coaches or personal trainers as well, and they can and I hear this all the time, that uh, you're writing training programs all day, and then, oh shoot, I have to write a training program for myself, uh, and I'm training in 2 hours, or I'm training the next morning, and you just don't have the energy, and it's just tough, right? Because you have that extra layer of kind of subjectivity to it. So the way I've kind of gotten around that, or at least to some degree attenuated it, is by like filling out our client check-in form and our monitoring questions very, very diligently. This has helped me recognize patterns way better, because ultimately that's all you're doing when you're coaching someone. So if you're coaching yourself, you need to be objective to recognize these patterns. So for me specifically, by filling out that check-in form on a regular basis, there's a spot to indicate about aches and pains. And I noticed about 3 strength blocks in a row that I had my anterior hip and or knee flare up at basically the exact same time within every single strength block. And the only way I was kind of able to put those pieces together is because I was able to look back 32 weeks and see that was the case, and it was kind of repeatable. I've also been able to kind of look back at the body weights at which I feel best and perform best at, by diligently tracking my body weight and performance and subjective input in terms of like scaled questions and just like an overall fatigue score that we track for clients. So instead of like a hand wavy like pattern recognition of just trying to like recall what happened at this time point in this block 3 cycles ago, I actually have concrete data to better solidify these patterns and ultimately make decisions I'm more confident in. So I think just being as objective as possible and good note taking, because that's what a coach will do. And that's, if you're self coaching yourself, that's what you need to do. And just being good about logging your training is kind of the first step there, and also logging some of these additional subjective input. Um, Another thing that comes to mind is just putting considerable thought and effort into your training plan, um, and just having buy-in that you put a lot of thought and effort into it, and it just gives you more confidence in the plan. So like myself and I think a lot of people can relate to this, like just would find themselves writing their own training program right before training, and that often leads to to bad outcomes. So like if you know you're about to go train in 2 hours, you're probably going to get pretty psychologically caught up in what you're going to do, and you probably have preferences for what you're about to do, but that might not be exactly what you should do, and that's just generally not a good place to write training from. So I literally have within like all my back end client systems a file for Josh Pelland for myself, which is kind of cringy if I'm being honest and saying it out loud. And Zach is laughing at me right now, but I'll own it, and it's helped a lot. It's made my motivation to train considerably higher. It's made my buy-in considerably higher. My confidence that I'm actually detecting these patterns higher, and it's just kind of a positive feedback loop. Whereas honestly, when times get busy and I don't take the extra 15 to 20 minutes every week just to do these things for myself, it just kind of is a negative feedback loop, and things don't go nearly as well. So um, yeah, I think just the general pattern recognition with concrete data is key, and that's kind of been my experience. And I think over the last about 10 months, I've been doing a much better job of the things I just talked about. I'm probably going to mess up at some point, to be clear, but over the last 10 months, my training has been considerably better than it has been, and probably the 10 months before that when I wasn't being as good about that. So, yeah, Zach, what do you think?
All right. Well, I'm going to take it from the other end of things because I'll be totally honest. Mine has been pretty terrible as the past however many months. Um, and I think one thing that I've noticed uh, for myself is very much along the lines of what you're saying. It comes down to, at least this is something I struggle with, and I think a lot of people that are caught up in kind of a similar part of the industry that we're in, like evidence based, that kind of thing. It can be challenging to totally accept when all the indicators of the data collection that you have are telling you that you're like meaningfully outside of what you expect to be successful, especially when that results in you doing less. That has been something that has been really hard for me to struggle with. So, I've been working through back hip pain for a while, and it's been a painstaking process to kind of like really dial in my auto regulatory strategies, know how much volume I should be training with to kind of manage with this kind of stuff, and just using all the things that Josh has talked about kind of from the other end to say, like, okay, I repeatedly demonstrate that I cannot tolerate this. And I continuously program myself things that I think will lead me to optimal outcomes, but the data in front of me is telling me I cannot, do this successfully, whether that be for a variety of reasons. So ultimately, you know, that's kind of my personal anecdote from it. But the note is, we have all these conversations and stuff that give you a really solid starting point. But as we always talk about, the systematic process is where things really shine and lead you to the best training outcomes long term. And taking that really strong data collection process and taking really good note taking, like Josh said, if you do that correctly and you do pick up good patterns, it could lead you to some pretty drastic individualization pieces. And I think you have to be very willing to just go with that. That's the whole point of what you're doing. And don't have that fear of missing out or anything like that in terms of like, oh, I'm not, this is a very basic example based on our last episode. I'm not hitting 10 to 20 sets per week per muscle group or whatever. Like that's just an easy example. Like if your data is reliably telling you 6 sets is the right way to go, just do it and roll with that and realize, I could get on my soapbox, but doing my PhD in individualization has been extremely eye opening to realize, we have all these data that we make these recommendations from, but the reality is the underlying, deviations and variance in a lot of these data for on the individual level is absolutely mind blowing. And it's just really important to really take yourself as an individual, and combining what Josh said of like really, really good note taking and being diligent about that, then just take the next step and follow those patterns kind of just willingly and almost, and don't have a ton of resistance to let yourself go where you need to go in terms of your training.
Yeah, I mean, I ultimately what you just kind of talked about there is kind of what gets us juiced up about research and what we do at Data Driven Strength, because um yeah, I mean, it just was very obvious to me right away when I got into this stuff that, like, some people walk through the gym and just blow up, some people don't, and then some people don't, but then when you get the program, kind of unnormal, right? Or you get a little bit creative, good things seem to happen. Like, that's exciting. How can we better do that? And yeah, it requires being objective, because it's tough. And I actually, we're trying to make this practical, but a quick little anecdote. I had I recently, I might have talked about this in a recent podcast episode, or maybe it was a discussion I had with a client. So I apologize if I'm repeating myself, but even if I am, I think it might be worth repeating. uh, Literally, we are down to 3 to 4 sets per muscle group per week. um, and it was really, really, really hard for me to accept that that was the right next step, but it was just so clear, abundantly clear, that that was the right move to go from an already low volume to like extremely low volumes. um and man, like, it's tough. So, like, yeah, like, that's out of the evidence-based range, but at the end of the day, those are not individual level recommendations, and that's why, or we'd like to think, coaching can be helpful, right? Or some sort of systematic processes can be helpful. And if you're not outsourcing that and you're doing it for yourself, I think that's key, especially if you maybe aren't the type of person that walks through the gym and just grows like a weed. And even if you are, you can benefit from it too. So anyway, I think we've done that justice. But Zach, do you have anything else to add? Cool. All right. Last question here is from, I believe you pronounce this Anas. Does that sound correct? I actually think this is one of Stephen Novi's clients. Um, so this is a really good question. He asks how to assess if a lifter is overstimulated or understimulated, and when to add/remove SBD work.
Yeah, that's a good question. So ultimately, kind of the idea here is the underlying premise of this question is like, what is leading to the lack of progression? Is we're trying to determine why we're no longer making progress. And I think off the bat, that's a very difficult question to confidently know the answer to. And I don't think there's really an objective way to determine that. Thus, it becomes about making our basically our best educated guess on what that is, and then trying to assemble some process to test it. And once again, this is just where coming just systematic with your overall training approach becomes absolutely vital. So, we're not making progress with our current batch of training. Let's make some modifications that either test the over or under stimulus kind of portion of this question. And then again, give things a period of time to test and see how our results change. As far as specific things that would kind of lead me in either direction of like what I think is more likely to be the case, obviously, just general reporting, subjective reporting of fatigue, soreness, um, lack of motivation to train, just kind of the general symptoms of overtraining. I would probably scoot a little bit more to the overstimulated side, or the overtraining side. Whereas if a lifter feels like they've left the session and not really trained, despite the training protocol being, something you would consider like a pretty solid workout, that could potentially be something to take into account and think to add something in, or that's volume, frequency, or changing your protocols to be a little bit more stressful within the current of training dose that you have. I'm trying to think of anything that isn't like those are kind of obvious, and I'm trying to think of like some alternative things that I kind of think about that are not coming immediately to the top of my mind. But those are kind of how I would determine, generally speaking, whether it's over or under. But again, in order to actually test that and see whether that is probably the case, you have to make modifications to the program and then give a similar amount of time to test that and see if you start to make progress again. That systematic process is absolutely key. And as far as specifically the end of this question of when to add or remove SBD work, I think this could be an entire another podcast within itself, because I think I immediately think of this question more so as volume allocation, in terms of how much of your volume is allocated towards the main lifts or close variations. We kind of view that as a separate training variable to volume itself, which does get a little bit tricky on which lever you think you should pull. But ultimately, I think the answer is similar in that regard. But again, I think that's a whole other conversation within itself. So I'll pitch it over to Josh while I try to remember those a little bit more creative strategies to determine the fatigue versus the under stimulus side.
Yeah. We'll maybe put a pin in the whole volume allocation thing, because I think that's a whole nother discussion. Um, and I'm guessing that Anas was probably more so just asking, like, okay, if someone is overstimulated, then you would presumably remove SBD work or just remove volume. And if someone is understimulated, you would add volume. Uh, I would question that. And I think this is a very common assumption of, like, if you can know fatigue levels, then you know the amount of volume to prescribe. I think that is completely wrong in my experience, and that's like might be kind of a hot take. I don't think fatigue is a good indication of where your volume should be. I think it can be very, very helpful to indicate troubleshooting, but in my experience, some people will perceive fatigue to be very, very high in within the training prescription that leads to the best progress. And every single time that happens, there's another person that will feel completely over recovered and feel like they should be doing way more. But that indeed is the best amount of work for them to do to maximize progress. Now, again, to be clear, I literally was just talking about like the fatigue score we use for our clients. Like, I think it's still useful because I can look back and see, um, you know, I made this change and that influenced fatigue in this direction. Or, yeah, if fatigue is super high and someone's not making progress, I'm obviously going to drop. I'm obviously going to drop the workload. It's going to inform the directionality of your troubleshooting, but I don't think that auto-regulating based on how you're feeling or your perception thereof, because actual fatigue and your perception of fatigue is a whole nother discussion, right? So that's something I've kind of been afraid to, or not afraid to, yeah, maybe like a little bit afraid to like accept that that's actually how I view things. But I've just kind of accepted that someone might feel pretty smoked from the workload that is required to see the most amount of progress. And again, similarly, someone might feel very over recovered and kind of feel like they're leaving the gym with some in the tank, or a good amount in the tank, but that's actually what's required for them to progress the best. So yeah, that's kind of my contribution to this question, is that I'm not sure if we should even think in that way.
I think I agree with that in part, but I guess I have a follow up question for you. We actually haven't talked about this before. I definitely agree that like there is a level of fatigue that is necessary. Like when you talk about like the fitness fatigue model and stuff like that, like that whole conversation is like a little bit in the clouds, and I think you can think about things in a different way there. Like, is fatigue necessary? Is it contributing towards the stimulus? All that. Let's put that aside for a second. I'm just saying, like, purely just from anecdotal perspective, like there is a level of fatigue that is necessary to make maximal progress in my experience as well. But my follow up question is that how, if you're saying that you're not using the perception of fatigue to guide which direction you're making that call, whether to bump up or down, how do you make that decision?
Oh, no. To be clear, I was saying that I would absolutely use it to troubleshoot.
Ah, okay. Okay, so you're saying you agree similar to what I'm saying. You're just saying that Zero fatigue is not the goal, basically.
I'm just saying you're not trying. Here, I'll summarize it as this: you're not trying to optimize for fatigue.
You're
You're trying to
optimizing for
optimize
progression.
for
Yeah.
progression,
Yeah, I agree.
and
Okay.
fatigue informs troubleshooting.
Yeah.
But if you look
It's
back,
relative.
yeah, it's relative, and also just like look back at what seems to work best for that individual and follow what works best for that individual, not necessarily what optimizes into this Goldilocks predetermined zone of fatigue or any other variable like that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think I could have misinterpreted you, but originally it sounded like you were saying that you basically don't consider that, but I agree with what you're saying now, and I think is what I said as well. Progression is by and by and far that is the number one factor of whether we're changing something or not. For some people that could result in some perceptions that aren't totally flowers and roses that don't feel the best. But if you're making rapid progression, and obviously it's not to the extent that we think you're going to get injured or have any pain, of course, but sometimes it does come with some discomfort to train as hard as you need to make maximal progression. If that's your goal, sometimes that's par for the course. That said, there's other people that feel totally fresh when they make their maximal progress that we can kind of find. So that is what Josh is saying is the secondary factor to say that's not what is driving the decision making process of whether or not to make a change. It's just a compass to kind of guide which direction you may try first.
Yeah, right on. And obviously, like common sense applies here. If someone is like completely run down and it's ruining their quality of life and their injury risk is higher, and
Yeah, you tell them you need another set.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
Yeah,
right.
yeah.
Okay.
I mean, you just you up the dose as always.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
no, but like actually, just to make sure no one takes that out of context, like to be very clear, like use common sense. But I'm just saying, like, um, I don't think that I should indicate. I just really question the premise of whether we're optimizing for fatigue, and I see people going down that route, and I just
This
just
is a really
hasn't
good.
been my experience.
Really, I believe this is his quote. I could be wrong. This is from an old podcast, but Ben Ezra has a quote that adaptation is never comfortable. I kind of like that. I think that can obviously be taken too far, but in a general sense, I think I tend to agree with that. You kind of got to do.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, 100. Like, yeah, for sure. I
It can
think
be
that.
uncomfortable in two ways. One, you could feel like you're not doing enough, and like the competitor, and you could be like, "Man, I'm only doing 4 sets a week, and I want to do."
Yeah,
That's
probably not what
uncomfortable.
he meant though.
Yeah, probably. Maybe not.
Maybe.
Ben's a smart guy. He could have had like triple meta layers to this. Who knows?
Yeah,
Whereas the other thing is like you want to outwork, um, just trying to feel fresh all the time. So I think it
yeah. I
kind of
mean, I
applies to
mean,
both ways.
I mean, I think a lot of people, when you program in a way where every single set has a goal and is executed with high quality, they kind of notice that they don't need to do as much as they thought, and they feel better. So like that's why I'm a little bit hesitant to use that as like a catch-all, in the sense of like adaptation is never comfortable, in the sense of like you always need to feel beat up, because I've had people where just like,
Well,
man, I'm
hold
progressing
on,
so much
hold
better
on.
and I feel better. Go for it.
Yeah. I see that, but I do think the opposite applies as well.
For sure, and
And
that's
I
what
think uncomfortable is very different than you know
beat up.
suffering or
Yeah,
miserable.
yeah, yeah. That
I think
definitely.
that's important. But yeah. This is we're rambling at this point.
Yeah, we're rambling.
Yeah,
We're just repeating the same thing over and over
yeah,
because, as always, we're never like completely confident in our observations, so we want to make sure that we don't mess anything up and make sure no one takes things out of context.
yep, cool. So we'll wrap this one up here, guys. Thanks for tuning in. Be sure to give us a hashtag Josh's back health to get his Kickstarter going here to get him a new chair. We'll try to get that installed for the next episode. But yeah, be sure to leave a comment, rating, review if you do like the show and you want to support future rambles from us. But as always, thanks for tuning in and thanks for all the questions from everybody. If we didn't get to your question, we'll try to get to it in a future episode, as always, and we'll tune in next time. Take care.